In a cookhouse in southern Italy, one night in the year 73 BC, about 70 men reached for the only weapons within arm's length: kitchen knives, iron cooking spits, cleavers still greasy from supper, and walked straight out of the building that legally owned them. Their leader was a gladiator, a Thracian, and his name was Spartacus. Within 2 years, that ragged handful of runaways would swell into an army so large that the most powerful state on earth began to fear, in the quiet of its own Senate house, that it might not survive the season. This is the story of the rebellion that shook Rome to its bones. And at the very center of it sits one decision, still argued over 2,000 years later, that may have cost Spartacus the only thing he ever truly wanted. Forget the Rome in your head, the emperors, the marble, the purple robes. In 73 BC, there is no emperor at all. Rome is a republic run by its Senate, and it is already the most powerful state the ancient world has ever seen. And every single stone of that power rests on the backs of people who own nothing, not even themselves. By some estimates, 1 in every 3 people in Italy at that time was enslaved. Think about that on the scale of your own street. Every third door, every third face, a person who could be bought, sold, worked, and handed on like a piece of furniture. They mined the silver, they farmed the vast estates, they cooked the dinners of the rich, and a small, unlucky share of them were bought for one purpose only: to fight for the amusement of a crowd. The word we still use for them, gladiator, comes straight from the gladius, the short iron sword they were trained to wield. They lived in a school called a ludus, and the man who ran it, who held their contracts and their lives, was a lanista. Spartacus belonged to the school of a lanista named Gladiators in the town of Capua, just north of the bay we now call Naples. It was, by every account, a hard place. You went out onto the sand to fight for your life, and losing meant you did not walk back off it. And this was not the first time the enslaved had risen. Twice before, within living memory, the island of Sicily had flared into revolt, and both times Rome had put the fire out. Rome even had a name for these uprisings: servile wars, and the one a gladiator was about to ignite would be the third, and by a very wide margin, the worst of them all. Here is what's strange. For a man whose name outlasted the empire that broke him, we know almost nothing certain about him. Plutarch, our best ancient source, tells us he was a Thracian from the wild lands north of Greece, a man of great spirit and, the historian adds, more Greek in intelligence than you'd expect. Some sources hint he had once served in the Roman army himself as an auxiliary before he deserted, was recaptured, and sold into the arena. If that's true, it explains a great deal about what came next, because this was no simple farmhand. This was a man who had learned from the inside exactly how a Roman army thinks. Plutarch passes on one more thing, and I'll give it to you as the legend it plainly is. When Spartacus was first brought to Rome to be sold, the story goes, a serpent coiled itself around his face while he slept. His wife, a prophetess of the god Dionysus, took it as a sign that a great and fearful power was gathering around him. Make of that what you will. The men in that cookhouse in Capua did not need omens. They needed a way out. The break itself was almost comically desperate. Roughly 70 of them rushed the kitchen, grabbed whatever could cut, and forced their way into the streets. On the road, they had a stroke of luck. They fell upon wagons carrying gladiators' weapons and armor to another town, and suddenly the cooks had swords. They fought off the first soldiers sent to round them up, and they ran for high ground. They ran to a mountain. The mountain was Vesuvius, and here's a detail that has always given me a slight chill. In 73 BC, Vesuvius was just a tall, green, ordinary-looking mountain, its slopes thick with wild vines. Nobody living beneath it had the faintest idea it was anything more. It would be another 150 years or so before that mountain woke up and buried the city of Pompeii under ash. The men climbing it for shelter were sitting on the most famous sleeping danger in history, and not one of them knew it. Two more names rise up beside Spartacus in these early days: Crassus, a Gaul, and a handful of other hardened fighters from the same school. As word spread across the countryside that a band of the enslaved had beaten Roman soldiers and taken to the hills, others began slipping away from the estates to join them. A trickle at first, then a stream. Rome's response tells you everything about how Rome saw the world. The Senate did not send an army. An army was for real enemies, for kings and rival cities. This was, in their eyes, a police matter, a nuisance of runaways to be swept up. They sent a man named Gaius Claudius Glaber with a scratch force of about 3,000 thrown together in a hurry. Glaber found the rebels camped near the summit of Vesuvius, with only one narrow path leading up. He did the obvious thing. He blocked the path, sat down at the bottom, and waited for hunger to do the work for him. What Glaber did not count on was imagination. The rebels looked at the wild vines choking the mountainside, and they wove them into long, rough ladders. On the sheer cliff on the far side of the peak, the side no one was watching, they climbed down, hand over hand in the dark, while a Roman force dozed at the only door they believed existed. They came around behind Glaber's camp and struck it from the rear. The Romans, caught completely off guard, were scattered in minutes. And this, for me, is the real lesson of the whole first year. Rome was not beaten on that mountain by numbers or by better weapons. Rome was beaten by its own contempt, by a flat refusal to believe that people it treated as property could possibly outthink a Roman commander. If you're with me on that Rome's arrogance was its own worst enemy here and cost it more than any sword ever could, then tap that like and stand on my side of it. And if you reckon Spartacus just got lucky early, that the Republic simply hadn't turned its head yet, go and make that case in the comments. I'll be reading, and I might just come round. Because after Vesuvius, Rome finally turned its head. Word of the victory ran through the estates of the south like fire through dry grass. They came in their thousands now. Herdsmen, field workers, the desperate and the furious, whole families walking off the land to follow a gladiator. The rebels wintered, drilled and organized. Spartacus, whatever else he was, turned out to be a genuine commander. He taught his people to hold a line and even set them to forging their own weapons from melted down iron. What had started as a jailbreak was becoming an army. By some ancient counts, the movement eventually reached 70,000 fighters, and if you include the women, children and elderly moving with it, figures well over 100,000 appear in the sources. Ancient numbers are always slippery, mind you, and I'd treat those with real caution. But even the cautious estimate is staggering. This was no longer a raid. This was a nation on the march, with no land of its own, roaming loose inside the heart of Italy. In 72 BC, Rome sent its proper magistrates against them, one after another, praetors, and then both of that year's consuls, the highest officials in the Republic, each at the head of a full army. It did not go the way Rome expected. Spartacus and his commanders beat them in the field, again and again. Roman armies, the terror of the known world, were being turned back by former cooks and herdsmen. In the marble halls of the Senate, the mood curdled from irritation into something much closer to fear. But an army with no country has to answer a terrible question. What now? And here the movement split down the middle. Crassus, the Gaul, wanted to stay in Italy, to keep raiding the rich estates that had held them, to make Rome pay in its own heartland. Spartacus wanted something colder and wiser. He wanted to march north, all the way to the Alps, and let his people scatter over the mountains to their homelands, the Gauls to Gaul, the Thracians to Thrace, not to conquer Rome, to leave it behind and finally be free. They could not agree. Crassus broke away with a large body of his fellow Gauls and Germans and took his own road. It ended badly. A Roman army caught his separated force near Mount Garganus on the spur of Italy's boot and overwhelmed it. Crassus was among those lost. Spartacus, the sources tell us, marked his fallen friend with funeral games, a dark, deliberate echo of the very arena that had enslaved them all. And then he pressed north, exactly as he had planned. His march north was a hammer blow. He beat the two consuls' armies that came at him, the men named Gellius and Lentulus, and then turned on the governor of the northern province, Gaius Cassius Longinus, near the town of Mutina, and beat him too. And suddenly, there it was, the Alps, the great white wall on the horizon, and beyond it, the open road to freedom for every soul following him. He had done the impossible. Nothing at all stood between his people and those mountains. And then Spartacus did the one thing no historian has ever fully been able to explain. He turned around. With the Alps in sight and the way out standing open, Spartacus led his entire host back south, into the belly of Italy, away from freedom. Nobody knows why. Some think his followers, drunk on victory, refused to leave the rich pickings of Italy behind. Some think he never truly meant to escape, and dreamed instead of striking at Rome itself. Some think the sheer human mass of 100,000 people simply could not be steered over a mountain range in winter. The ancient writers themselves seem baffled by it, and honestly, I have sat over maps of that campaign and tried to reason my way into his head, and I cannot make the turn make sense. If you think you know why a man would walk his people right up to the door of freedom and then march them back into the fire, I would genuinely love to read your theory down below, because 2,000 years of historians have never settled it. Whatever his reason, the turn south sealed his fate. Rome had finally stopped sending it magistrates and started sending it money, in the shape of the richest man in the Republic. His name was Marcus Licinius Crassus, and he was wealthy on a scale that's hard to describe politely. He is often called the richest man in all of Roman history, and you want to know how he got that rich. Here is my favorite, faintly appalling detail in the whole story. Crassus kept a private fire brigade, a crew of some 500 trained builders. When a house caught fire in Rome, his men would rush to the scene and then simply stand there, doing nothing, while Crassus haggled with the panicking owner over a knockdown price. Buy the burning building cheap and the ones beside it cheaper, put the fire out afterward, rebuild, and profit. He turned other people's disasters into a property empire. That was the man Rome now aimed at Spartacus. Crassus raised 10 new legions at his own expense and took command of the war. His first act was aimed not at the rebels, but at his own soldiers. A portion of his army had panicked and run in an early clash, and Crassus decided to make an example so terrifying that no legion of his would ever run again. He revived an ancient and dreaded punishment called decimation. The word means, quite literally, the removal of 1 in 10. Every 10th man in the disgraced units was chosen by lot to answer for the failure of them all. It was merciless, it was deliberate, and it worked. His legions came to fear him far more than they feared any enemy. And here is where the past reaches a cold finger into your present. That word, decimation, is one we still use every single day. When we say a storm decimated a town or an illness decimated a population, we are reaching back, without knowing it, to a punishment Crassus dealt his own men on an Italian roadside 20 centuries ago. With his terrified, disciplined legions at his heels, Spartacus was pushed further and further south, all the way down into the toe of Italy to the region of Bruttium. And here he gambled everything on a plan to get his people across the sea. Just off the coast lay the island of Sicily, an island with its own long memory of the enslaved rising up, a place where a new revolt might catch light. All Spartacus needed was ships. He struck a bargain with a fleet of Cilician pirates, sea raiders from the coast of what is now Turkey, who agreed for a heavy payment to ferry his fighters across the narrow strait. He paid them, and then he stood on that shore and watched the sails shrink on the horizon, because the pirates took his silver and simply never came back. Whatever that felt like, there isn't a clean word for it. Betrayed by the sea, Spartacus was now trapped in the toe of Italy, and Crassus moved to seal the lid. In an astonishing feat of engineering, Crassus had his legions dig a fortified ditch and wall clean across the neck of the peninsula from one coast to the other, a barrier miles long meant to pen the rebels in and starve them out. For once, it was Rome that had built the trap. But on a wild winter night, the snow is driving sideways and the wind is screaming in off the water, and Spartacus is filling a stretch of that ditch with earth and timber and anything that will hold. He forces a part of his people through the line and out into open country. The lid would not hold him. Not yet. But the walls were closing now in a way no ditch could fix. The Senate, alarmed that the war had dragged on for 2 full years, summoned a second great general to finish it. Pompey, fresh and famous, marching home from Spain. And this lit a fire under Crassus that had nothing to do with Spartacus at all. Crassus had poured his own fortune into this war, and he was not about to let Pompey stroll in at the last moment and take the credit for ending it. He needed the thing finished, and finished before Pompey arrived. He drove his army after Spartacus with everything he had. They met for the last time in the spring of 71 BC in the region of Lucania, near the river the Romans called the Silurus. Spartacus knew what was coming. Legend tells us that before the fighting began, he gave up his own horse in front of his men, the idea being that if they won the day, he could take his pick of the enemy's mounts, and if they lost, he would have no need of a horse at all. He would stand on foot and share whatever came with the people who had followed him out of the arena. It was the gesture of a man who had already made his peace. The two armies come together, and the fighting is enormous, and it is final. This is the end of the road, and every man on that field seems to know it. The rebel army was broken, and somewhere in the heart of that last stand, Spartacus fell. His body was never found, never identified. The man whose name would outlive Rome itself simply vanished into the ground of the field he had chosen. What Rome did next was not about winning. The war was already won. It was about sending a message that no enslaved person in Italy would ever forget. Roughly 6,000 of the captured rebels were sentenced, and the great road that runs 130 miles from Capua, where it had all begun, up to the very gates of Rome, the Appian Way, was turned into a warning that stretched without a single break for the entire length of that highway. For years afterward, anyone traveling that road, a merchant, a soldier, a farmer, a child, passed that warning mile after mile after mile. Rome wanted the lesson carved into the memory of a whole generation. Rise against us, and this is where the road ends. And there is one last, bitterly human twist. As the fighting ended, a group of rebels fleeing north ran straight into Pompey's army arriving from Spain, and Pompey swept them up. He then sat down and wrote the Senate a letter that would sour Roman politics for years. Crassus, he wrote, had beaten the enemy in open battle, But he, Pompey, had pulled the war up by its roots. 2 years of hard campaigning, the fortune Crassus had burned through, the ditch across Italy, all of it, and Pompey claimed the whole thing in a single sentence. Crassus never forgave him. And I have to say, if you've ever watched a colleague present your work to the boss as their own, some part of this 2,000-year-old grudge is going to feel uncomfortably familiar. Here is the part that history loves. These two men, who now genuinely disliked each other, Crassus and Pompey, were both elected consul the very next year. And within a decade, they would set their loathing aside long enough to join forces with a rising young politician named Julius Caesar in the private pact we call the First Triumvirate, the very deal that would help tear the Roman Republic apart and hand Rome over to the emperors. The rebellion of an enslaved gladiator did not bring Rome down, but it helped raise up the very men who would. And Spartacus? A man who owned nothing, whose real face and real story are half lost to us, became one of the most enduring symbols of defiance in all of human history. That road he never got to walk to freedom, the Appian Way, is still there. You can walk long stretches of its original paving today, outside Rome, the same worn stones under your feet. Karl Marx named Spartacus as the historical figure he most admired. Revolutionaries in Germany, led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, called themselves the Spartacus League and rose up in 1919. And when a great film about him swept the world in 1960, it gave us that unforgettable moment where the captured rebels, ordered to give up their leader, each stand and claim to be him, "I am Spartacus," so that no single one of them can be picked out. A gesture of loyalty so powerful that the phrase entered our language and never left. He lost. Let's be honest about that. He lost, and the cost was terrible. But he frightened the greatest power on earth so badly that it spent a fortune, revived its cruelest old punishments, and hired its richest man for the single purpose of being rid of him. And 2,000 years later, we are still saying his name. If this walk back into the ancient world held you the whole way through, then come with me for the next one. Subscribe here to Mystique History and tell me down in the comments which forgotten rebel, which lost cause, which name history tried to bury you'd like me to dig back up. I read every one of them, and more often than not, they're the reason I choose where I go next, because empires are built to be remembered. But sometimes it's the ones who owned nothing who echo the longest, the man with no country, no crown, and no grave, whose name outran the very road they meant to end him on.